If you're happy with the same old ways of dating,
If you enjoy sucking at communication,
and you have no desire to improve your romantic life, then our podcast might not be for you.
but if you want some out-of-the-box ideas to deepen your current relationships,
broaden your sexual horizons,
develop a better understanding of yourself,
or learn more about non-monogamy,
Then you've come to the right place. I'm Jase,
I'm Emily.
and I'm Dedeker.
and this is the Multiamory podcast.
Forcing me to form myself to fit.
On this episode of the Multiamory podcast, we are talking about deconstructing jealousy, taking a look at the main factors that can trigger jealousy and the best ways to handle them.
It's
So-
like we never left.
No, I was going to say, so it may seem to our regular listeners that, like, jealousy, that's an easy topic. Like, haven't you covered that before? And, like, I just want to ask you to please have some compassion for us because we have not sat in the same room without a live audience and podcasted in, like, over a month now. And
Yeah, that's a
it feels
long
really
damn
weird.
time.
Yeah,
it feels
it's-
really odd.
It is funny being back in the studio.
Now, should I pull a diva act? Like, unless there's an audience, I can't do this?
No, that's
Get
bullshit.
the cats in here, get somebody in here.
Oh my god, I need like that emotional support
Exactly,
and that laughter.
exactly. I need the energy.
I need the
Right.
laughter.
Maybe no, that's true. Like maybe it's I got so used to getting all that energy from the audience that now when I'm expected to produce it on my own, I'm like, what?
What?
What is this?
It's okay. We have to get it from within, guys.
Right.
This is an important task that we need to
What
have
if?
happen.
Okay, but what
Yeah.
if we started recording the podcast with a laugh track?
No,
Oh,
we're not gonna do that. Have we sunk so low?
I
We are now like comedy hour.
I know. Now we're like daytime sitcom style.
Well, nighttime, but yes.
Yeah.
Nighttime
Half-hour
sitcom style.
comedy.
Primetime sitcoms.
Yeah.
You got the laugh track. Yeah.
I suppose so. What if we got like a goat track? Where it's just a bunch of bleeding goats.
okay.
Sorry, that came into my head and it doesn't make any sense,
all right.
but
Oh, man.
it made me laugh.
Oh boy. I hope we
Okay,
edit that
so
out before
jealousy.
the final
So
episode.
what
All right.
is jealousy?
What is jealousy? All right, so something that I did want to clarify before we get into this episode is that there are a lot of people... Like, okay, first of all, jealousy is a topic that gets talked about and asked all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you're first telling people about polyamory, when they first start looking into it, that's like always the number one question, right?
But what about jealousy? Don't you get jealous?
Right, how do you handle jealousy? Like, wouldn't jealousy just make that awful?
How do you fight off gel-based life forms? Sorry, I'm really,
You're really
coming
just-
from left field today.
This is bad.
I'm a little-
This is
sorry,
these
I'm
are
a
some
little-
bad goofs.
I'm a little bit ill,
Griffin's
and
gophers.
my brain's a little fuzzy. Sorry, keep going. I'll just sit this one out.
Okay.
Oh.
So it's a topic that is asked a lot. And one of the ways that people try to tackle it is by making this distinction between envy and jealousy. And something I wanted to clarify there is that, yes, those are two different terms, but I actually find that making this distinction between them can actually be less helpful because when you actually look at the dictionary definitions of them, there's some overlap. And basically it's the distinction between envy and jealousy. That envy means that somebody else has something that you want. And so it's this, negative, envious feeling of, I want to get that thing that they have.
And that you're specifically going to take it from the other person?
Right, that there's this desire to take this from the
Yeah.
other person. That's kind of a secondary part of it. I think envy doesn't necessarily have to have that second
Okay.
part, but it often
Does.
is implied
It
that I
often
want
will,
to take
yeah.
that from them.
Yeah.
Whereas the definition of jealousy has two different definitions. The first one is that same thing of, being jealous of something someone else has and wanting to take it for yourself. But then the second part of the definition is being afraid that someone is going to take something from you, which
Yeah.
is often when people are talking about jealousy in terms of polyamory or in terms of their relationships, they're usually using that second definition. And so some people try to make this distinction that jealousy is that, like the fear of losing something, and that envy is wanting something from someone else. And it's just that the actual definition doesn't support that distinction. So for the purposes of this episode, it kind of covers both of those things.
Yeah.
But anyway, just so you know, we're not going to be making that distinction between those two terms in this episode.
Well, Yes.
And just to remind people that this is a very universal human emotion. You know,
Yes.
that crops up not just in sexual situations, not just in romantic situations, but we experience envy and jealousy in all arenas of life. We get jealous of coworkers, of friends, of family members, of siblings. You know, we experience jealousy in so many different arenas, and specifically in the arena of romantic and sexual jealousy, that's the one that seems to scare people the most.
Right. That we're all kind of taught as like healthy, mature adults when you're jealous of a friend or a coworker because of whatever, because they got a new job, because they have a sweet new car, because they got married, like whatever it is, we're kind of taught that, as a healthy person, you don't let that destroy your relationship with them, right? That it doesn't drive you insane. You just, as an adult, you handle that and you deal with it and maybe let it inspire you to get those things yourself.
Yeah,
but
it's a motivating factor, potentially.
Yeah, but we kind of have this understanding that jealousy is manageable in those situations.
Well, while we're on the subject of it being a universal emotion, what are some personal triggers for jealousy for us? Like, for instance, for me, I think... the possibility, sometimes I get jealous of the idea that, like, my partner may have a better sexual experience with someone else rather than me.
Sure.
That's a scary thing sometimes, and that's a trigger.
That's a really common one also.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, the term that I've heard for that, too, is FOMO.
Yeah.
I'm sure you guys have come across this. Fear of missing out.
FOMO.
FOMO.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that. It doesn't like quite fit the definitions exactly, but it kind of falls into this same thing of I'm worried that they're going to have some great time without me.
Yeah,
I'm afraid I'm missing out on something.
Sure, and that I'm therefore like they're going to maybe want to be with that person more because they're giving them a sexual experience that is not as good or that's better than something I could give them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
I know what's triggered jealousy for me is if I feel like another person is quote unquote kind of encroaching on the things that make up my own identity. So to give an example of that, it's actually when one of my partners first started dating Emily, that I got really jealous because after I learned that she was also really nerdy and really into video games.
Legend of Zelda.
And I was like, wait, but that's my thing. And so things like that, which are so silly, but for some reason it's like I get triggered if I feel like my uniqueness is kind of competing against somebody else's.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a trigger for me today in terms of the like more envy side of jealousy is that Emily was showing off her new Nintendo Switch.
Fuck yeah.
With the new Zelda game, and I'm very envious of that.
As you should be.
Yeah.
As you should be.
Yeah. No, I mean, for me, it's that kind of jealousy trigger has kind of changed and evolved over time. Like for me, for a while, it was really focused around money. And I've experienced this seems to really resonate with a lot of men, especially.
Yeah. I want to go into that later.
Yeah, totally. That this idea that, if somebody else makes more money than me, that they're inherently more desirable than me or more confident than me or just kind of better than me. So my partner would rather spend their time with that person instead of me.
Yeah, but I've totally had that myself, even as a woman.
Sure.
Of if my partner's dating someone that I perceive is better off than me, that brings up the same levels of insecurity. Probably a different shade from what men experience because we're so used to men being socialized to be the breadwinners and the supporters and the providers.
Even now, which is hilarious.
Yeah, exactly. But so for me, it's been less of feeling like that territory is being encroached on, more in just this person's just better than me or just more successful than me that triggers that.
Yeah.
But I do want us to think about, like, as we're going through the different catalysts and triggers for jealousy, is it something that's inherently male or inherently female?
Yeah.
I know that, when we discussed this before, we kind of found similarities and differences in both genders for the specific things in which we'll be talking about, but I guess I kind of want to like go back through them and say like, hey, is this a more inherently male or a more inherently female thing?
Well, and I would just want to clarify
Sure.
using the word inherently always
Well, okay,
triggers me a little bit. Right.
socially triggered or socially taught or
Sure,
whatever.
sure.
Like,
Socialized.
Yeah,
there is
exactly.
There is this debate of like how inherent are
Is
these
anything,
male and
really?
female differences,
That is
or is
always
it
the question.
all socialization?
Yeah.
Sure.
I tend to fall a lot more on the all socialization
I
side
agree with you. Yeah.
than some people. So yeah, just kind of depends. But
Yeah.
regardless, those distinctions between males and females do exist.
Yes.
Whether or not they're inherent or just cultural, we do still have those as part of our lives as people living in Western culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
definitely,
wonder
yeah.
if the lines are blurred now more as like time goes on and as like women's liberation or whatever continues to occur,
Yeah,
if like the lines
definitely.
become more blurred. I don't know.
Definitely, yeah.
So let's talk about it.
So in
Yeah.
this episode, we're specifically kind of breaking down triggers for jealousy into 4 broad categories. And in these 4 categories, there is a lot of overlap. A lot of them are connected to each other. But I found that in being able to kind of categorize and figure out kind of what exactly is the dynamic that's triggering my jealousy, it helps to kind of unlock, like, well, what's going to be the key to making it feel a little bit better.
yeah.
So what's our first one?
Okay, the first one is going to be comparison. And when I look at this, I see it as an inherently female thing. And it not necessarily inherently, okay, socialized it, yeah,
No, sure,
it's a
no.
social female thing. For a female to be like, fuck, like that bitch is, and not necessarily, of course, like men compare as well, but it's challenging sometimes because women will look at other women and say, and use slut shaming or use a bunch of different tactics, I guess, to sort of put women down. So comparing your own worst qualities or weaknesses to someone else's best qualities or
I think
strengths.
that's sort of the key there.
Yes.
Is that just that you're not comparing like your best qualities to their like medium qualities. It's always like, look, they're good at this thing
Exactly.
that I'm insecure about being bad at.
Totally.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So that hurts a lot more. That's a lot harder to deal with.
Yeah.
I was actually reading, since we did this write up for this episode, actually was reading about some studies about social media and showing a link between how much time people spend on social media and how much depression they feel.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
And the sort of, the possible cause for that is that you're constantly being exposed to everyone's best self
Yeah.
that they're putting out there. And so when you're comparing yourself to that,
You're like,
you're
way
coming up
worse.
short.
Yeah.
exactly.
Exactly. You're like,
Yeah.
well, shit, I'm not good enough. I'm not successful enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not doing enough exciting things, like whatever it is.
Yeah.
Interestingly, as a fun side note, Snapchat, however, was shown to increase the happiness of people who
Really?
used it, as opposed to Facebook, which makes people more depressed. And
Is-
more
Maybe
Is
that's
the
why Snapchat's IPO just went way up.
Is the idea with Snapchat that you can be less contrived with it and
think
less
that's the
orchestrated
idea,
with it,
that
or at least a
because
little
it-
bit less
because
it
it-
forces you to be very in the moment.
Well, and it's pretty
Exactly.
raw in comparison. Like
Exactly.
Facebook
Love it.
Facebook is very shiny, and Snapchat tends to be
Yeah.
like very gritty in comparison, except for when you're using the filters.
Well,
but
there-
still,
but
even
you,
then,
but even
the
with
filters
Snapchat,
make you look silly.
you can still be very selective
Yeah.
in when you're going to show someone something on Snapchat. Like
Sure.
you still can kind of cherry pick and show
Sure.
just the cool things that you're
Sure.
doing.
You
People
can,
do.
but-
Anyway, I don't know the causes of it, but I did think that was a fun little thing about the different ways that we can engage on social media
Yeah.
and how
Yeah,
how they can
true.
affect us differently.
Yeah. Okay, so when you're in a relationship, what are some of the ways in which the bad ways that you may try to combat this jealousy that's coming up within you, for comparison specifically?
Yeah, I mean, definitely if you find yourself struggling with comparing yourself to other people or comparing yourself to your partner's other partners, there can definitely be a temptation to try to control who your partner can date.
Yeah.
Obviously, the idea being that, well, as long as my partner doesn't date someone who's threatening to me, then there's no problem.
Or setting up a situation like a veto that's like, yes, it's letting me control who they can date. Or even something, that partners will set up of like a screening process. Like
Yeah.
if you want to date someone, I have to like interview them or talk to them first and give you the okay.
Or even,
It's-
yeah.
Well, it's this idea of like saying, well, I don't have to or thinking that you won't have to worry as much about comparing yourself to them if you are given power over them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Or the idea that, like, even that's potentially a little more subconscious than all that, but, like, having an emotional breakdown before a partner goes on a date and being like, I need you now, like, every single time they go out with someone that you are jealous of.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, someone that you compare yourself to.
Exactly.
But what about, like, what are healthier ways to manage this in a relationship?
Right. I mean, it seems almost too easy to say it, but actually, honestly and clearly communicating.
Yeah.
Right? It's communicating about what is the reassurance that I need from my partner. And I think this can also help if you understand that your partner is going through this kind of comparison-based jealousy, to really go out of your way to let them know the things that make them special that are unique.
Yeah.
So
We talked about that on Valentine's Day. It's very important.
Yeah. But so the key is not to be like, oh, well, this other person, they're not really that great. Or like, it's not about that.
Yeah, it's not about trying to downplay the other person.
Because then it just seems like, oh, you're hiding it from me because they're amazing and you're going to leave me for them.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But instead, really focusing on what is it, like what are those awesome points about your partner?
Yeah.
And I think that can also be something you can ask for.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and obviously, just to be clear, it can be very scary to actually go to your partner and say, you know what, your other partner, like, seems like he's really rich. And
is he really rich? Because he seems like he is.
Well, I mean, but maybe he actually is. But it can be like, you know what, I actually feel really insecure because your partner is, like, really rich and he can afford to take you out all the time and I can't. And, like, I'm really struggling with that. And that is a huge thing to be able to do. That takes a lot of courage. But that's probably, I think, the fastest way to actually getting reassurance from your partner.
Yeah, definitely.
And meet your metamor.
Yes.
Meet that rich guy. He's just a guy.
Yeah. That's the thing, is actually meeting this person in the flesh can really help to dissuade you from only being able to see their good sides or imagine their good sides. Like, you actually get to see them as a living, breathing human being. And it doesn't necessarily mean that when you meet them you're going to see all these flaws.
Sure.
You know,
Right, let's be clear on that.
But you'll still see them as, like, a real human
exactly,
being.
but you'll see them as normal.
Exactly.
Right.
Not
It
this,
helps.
like, rich three-headed dragon.
Right, that it helps humanize them a little bit. And
Yeah.
I found, for me at least, meeting someone in person as opposed to just seeing pictures of them, especially just seeing pictures of them with with one of my partners, looking happy and impressive and fit on Facebook and going to amazing exotic locations,
Yeah.
that actually meeting them in person makes it, I know this sounds like super woo-woo here, but it, like, makes it easier to love them in whatever way that is, right? But it makes it easier to go, like, cool, like, I want this person to be happy because they're actually a person I've met in real life. Like, they're someone that it isn't
They're a
just
real
an idea.
boy.
They're a
You're
real
a real boy.
You're a real boy.
boy. Yeah.
All right,
Okay, we
what's
gotta
the
move on
next
to the
one?
next one.
This
Yeah,
is a
what's next?
male-oriented one, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, so this one is competition. And I think that competition and comparison can get, easily mixed up with each other.
But they're not quite the same thing.
Right. So the idea is that this one is based around the idea that there are a limited amount of resources out there, whether that is in the bigger picture of the world, like money or something like that. But more specifically, this tends to come up with, like, the amount of time or the amount of affection that your partner has, or the amount of attention or something like that. That it's based around this idea that I'm jealous of this other person because in order for them to get anything, they're having to take it from me.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's a limited amount.
Yeah,
out
we
there.
got this interesting email a while back where this woman like really
Yeah.
wanted to be okay with polyamory, but the thing that she was having a hard time with is that she's, like, described that her partner's day is like a pie, and that, like,
And that's it. It's
like,
just like this
one
limited
slice
amount
of
of
the pie
time.
is his romantic time.
Yeah.
And so if he has another partner, that means I'm getting half of that slice of pie, and, like,
Right.
I want the whole slice of pie. And so it's this
I want my
idea.
pie and to eat it too.
Exactly. It's this
Yeah.
idea that, no, there's not enough to go around. And of course, we're not making the claim that, time is infinite, because time is finite. But this idea that the love, the attention, the quality time, that there's not enough to go around, like, I'm having to sacrifice to someone else what should be mine.
Yeah.
So what are some bad examples of ways people think they can handle this that actually does more damage than good?
So again, like, limiting the amount of time that they can spend with that partner, which is exactly what we're talking about. Saying, like,
Yeah.
hey, like, if you're going out with this person, then I need to be going out with someone as well. Or we can only see people once a week, for example.
Yeah. I need 5 nights a week with
exactly.
you. Or, this many. And I think people often conflate quality of time with quantity of time as well, for sure. Because, I mean, that was our response to that woman, is this idea of like really examining like, well, what is actually the quality of time that you want, rather than confusing it with the quantity of time.
Yeah.
Because some people will be fine seeing you once a week if that's good quality time.
Yeah.
Right.
And some people won't be. Like people's needs for quality time are very different.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what was going on in her email too was tying commitment to time, to just spending downtime together. To her, that meant commitment.
Yeah.
And I do think that for a lot of people that does seem to be the case, right? Because we associate being in a committed relationship with moving toward living together.
Spending all of your free time together.
And all of your free time, that you're always the other's plus one to everything, that you're
Yeah.
never like not around each other.
Yeah.
Like if you need a night to yourself, it's like, oh shit, something's wrong. And I think that a lot of the solutions people try to come up with, of like you said, of you can only go out with someone if I have a date the same night.
Sure.
I know a lot of couples that actually do that.
Definitely. Yeah.
Which will often end up being really difficult for whichever partner is the one who made that rule.
Yeah.
They'll be like, oh, I have a date Thursday, and then the other one's like scrambling to try
to
find
like, fuck,
anybody
I gotta do this.
to go out with that night
Yeah.
to be able to make that happen. So
Yeah.
it can end up actually causing a lot more problems and a lot more hurt along the way.
Yeah.
I think another factor to this competition thing is a lot of people kind of try to make sure, like, my sense of security lies in making sure that I'm getting the most.
Yeah.
Or that I'm getting more than anyone else. Like, I don't mind sharing. I don't mind my partner having multiple partners, as long as I get the most time, the most attention, the most love. Which, again, I mean, I
It's
think...
a very, like, hierarchical way of viewing
I think that it's a
things.
little bit of a product of Western culture, and I think also of American culture as well.
Okay. Why
Okay.
specifically?
Well, we're living in a very competitive culture.
Of course.
It's very much about, like, you got to carve out your space, you got to take what you can get,
Right.
Like, and so I think that that's something that kind of pushes those of us who grew up in those cultures towards this more sense of competitiveness, of that, like, okay, I know I'm okay as long as, like, I'm on top.
Sure.
I know I'm okay as
Yeah,
long as I
yeah.
have secured my access to more than what somebody else has.
This is something that you talk about in your book.
Oh, do I?
Among all of these
There's
things.
so many things in that
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now what are some good examples? I know we talked about the bad for a little while here. But what are some good examples? I feel like one that we hinted at a little bit is switching your focus to quality of time over quantity of time.
Yeah.
I know that this was something when Emily and I lived together. What we found was that it was really easy to be like, yeah, all our sort of time that we don't have other plans is together, which we would spend like watching Breaking Bad or Battlestar Galactica or like whatever we were into at the time.
But the quality of it wasn't like, it wasn't a specific day set aside to go out on a date or get dressed up or have like an actual thing that we were going out to do. And therefore it didn't feel as special.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, even though you're spending more of your time together, you still
the
feel
quality
jealous
didn't feel as much, as
and
high.
I think that the other part of it is not just quality, but intentional time.
Yeah.
And what we found is that if the way you structure your life, like, assuming that you have a partner that you live with or some kind of primary relationship like that, is that the assumption is, well, all my default time goes to them unless I make some other plans, whether it's hanging out with my buddies from work or if it's going out on a date.
Yeah.
But when the time you spend with that existing partner is just your like free time, your extra time, then any time you make a plan with somebody else, it has to take away from that.
Yeah, it can kind of have that feeling of like, oh, you've taken away from this time that was technically, like, by default belonged to somebody.
And now, if you imagine the contrast to that being like, we've made plans for ourselves, we've also scheduled dates in addition to the other dates that we schedule with other people.
Yeah.
That's like, oh, so we know that this one night a week, in addition to our free time, which sure we're going to spend together, but we know we're going to have like a good chunk of time to like really be together and pretty ourselves up a bit, right? And like really, be there and focus on that quality of the time,
and focus
and
on
the
each other.
intentionalness.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that made a big shift once I started realizing the importance of that.
Having
Yeah.
And so,
intention
like,
still.
right now, while Dedeker's living with me for a few months, like, we've started to be like, oh, shit, right, we have to do that now.
Yeah,
we have to actually set aside time.
Our time, so it's not just
the
filler.
Constant.
The filler,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
There's
Yeah.
one last thing I want to hit on with this competition thing, and actually, Jase's next blog post is going to be about this.
Uh-huh.
And I think it can be very important to examine, if you're feeling competitive about something, figuring out, like, what's actually driving that desire to
Yeah.
compete. Like, is it competition for competition's sake? Like, are you feeling competitive over something that you don't actually want?
Right. And actually, by the time this episode comes out, that
It'll
blog
be
post
out?
will have
Okay,
already
great.
been out. So.
I have a personal example of this.
Yeah,
Actually, when
yeah.
Jase and I were in Japan, we were
Yeah.
staying in separate places, and like the next day we got together to like co-work, and he told me about how the night before he'd gone out to a club, he brought somebody home, like had a good time, and then
Yeah.
they parted ways. And like I had this weird competitive feeling, not like that I was jealous of Jase, but I was competitive, like, well, I want like fun, sexy post-club times, like post-club hookups, like I want to get that too. And then literally like 2 minutes later, I was like, wait.
Do I really?
Wait. First of all, I hate going out to clubs. So, like, for me to imagine myself going out to a club,
Right.
meeting a random stranger,
Yeah.
taking them home at 3 a.m., having some what's probably going to be less than satisfying sex,
Yeah.
and then parting ways in the morning, I'm like, no, I don't actually want that. And then as soon as I realized that, I was like, oh, like, now I feel great.
That's
Right.
Like, it was
awesome.
purely just competition for, like, competition's sake, which is so
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah, and this is something that in that blog post I talk about realizing a lot of different ways in my life that this has come around.
Yeah.
Even in terms of just the amount of sex that someone else has.
Yeah.
To be fair, also, I was in the middle of like trying to finish my book manuscript, and my whole life was just
Right.
like all work and no play.
Yeah,
And-
totally.
So,
Sure.
Yeah.
I just wanted some.
But yeah, just like even with the amount of sex that I found that I would be jealous of a partner getting what
More
I saw
sex
as
with
like
someone.
more sex, or
Yeah.
they had sex at some point when I didn't. And then when I really finally, and it took a while, like years, to finally step back and be like, wait a minute, actually, I was doing other stuff. Like, I was actually preferring the video games I was playing or hanging out with my friends or whatever it was.
To the sex you weren't having.
Right.
Yeah.
I would like that it is this weird thing of like, I think especially for guys, you're socialized that like you should be wanting sex all the time.
Yeah.
And so if you're ever not getting it, you're not doing a good enough job. You must not be happy. It's kind of like the stuff we talked about in our single poly
sure.
episode of like
Yeah.
people tell you if you're not in a relationship, you must not be happy.
Yeah.
I feel like we tell guys like if you're not having sex this often, as often as
Yeah.
possible, then you must not really
You're
be
not
happy
virile
or
and
something.
Yeah.
It's like,
satisfied or-
I don't always need that.
Yeah.
all the time.
For sure.
And that was a big realization for me.
Yeah.
Was making that.
So
Fear.
this one's fear.
Fear.
Fears kind of undercuts comparison and competition, and a lot of what triggers jealousy is a lot of it boils down to fear. Because these situations, having to stay alone when your partner's out on a date, or seeing your partner get really excited about a new partner, or knowing that your partner is off having some fantastic sex that you're not having. These
That FOMO again.
the FOMO, these speak to our deepest insecurities. They really cut down to these very universal fears, these fears of rejection, fears of being alone, fears of being left out, fears of being unloved, fears of being inferior to somebody, or being perceived as inferior to somebody. And it's really, fear is a freaking powerful thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
Oh, yeah.
and it really does not feel good. We don't like feeling afraid. And so this can cause any number of knee-jerk reactions when a partner does something that triggers our fear.
Yes. This one does, I would say, of all of these, tend to trigger the most of those kind of like impulse reactions.
Yeah.
Those outbursts of anger or blame or like trying to find something else because you don't want to accept how terrified you are.
Because you don't want to feel afraid.
Because you don't you don't want to admit to yourself that you're afraid. You're so desperate to fix this situation that it does. I feel like this one of all of them tends to have the most of those kind of like flash in the pan kind of moments.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is like when people pull the ripcord.
Right.
Yeah, and say stuff like ultimatums. Like,
Right.
I'm
Like,
only
it's
going to
him or
stay with
me,
you
or-
exactly if you do X or whatever.
Yeah.
And then like demands of security, saying like we're not allowed to fall in love with anyone.
Yeah.
And that's how we're going to
sure.
stay
So
safe.
Yeah, let's get into that.
Yeah.
So what are some of these bad ways that people try to
Well, yeah, like
deal with fear?
promise me I'll always be the most important person in your life.
Yeah, you know, some people can demand primary status.
Yes.
Purely out of fear, purely
Yeah.
because I'm really afraid of someone else getting the things that you would give to a primary, and it can become a panic thing. You know, some people will, because they're so afraid, they will panic and be like, okay, we got to close our relationship.
Sure.
Right now, you got to break up with everybody you're seeing, and I'll break up with everyone I'm seeing, and then things will be great. And P.S., it's not going to be great.
Yeah.
Right? Or like on that episode of Compersion, where he like makes her in front of him get on
Yeah,
speakerphone and
yeah,
break
that
up with
was
the guy that
super
she's
fucked
dating.
up.
It's
So
like
bad.
so awful to watch. It's so painful to watch. But
Yeah.
that's absolutely something that people will do in that kind of fear reaction.
Well, so okay, but this is the thing: is like everyone gets afraid.
Sure.
Like human beings just get afraid. It's a good thing. It's what's helped us to evolve. It's what's helped our ancestors to avoid dying in many situations, was
Right.
being afraid. So it's not like we want to become necessarily fearless at all, or like totally numb our emotions. But like how do you tackle this?
You heal them.
Yeah. So I want to be like a little bit Buddhist for a moment.
Okay.
Here.
You know, I love Buddhism.
So something that in Shambhala specifically, in the Shambhala,
Sacred Path of the Warrior.
Yes. So in Shambhala, Sacred Path of the Warrior, fantastic book, highly recommend it. But talks a lot about the idea of fearlessness, and that fearlessness is not a feeling. It's not a lack of fear. I'm not fearless because I don't have fear. I'm fearless because I'm willing to accept that fear and not have it control me or destroy me.
Yeah.
Right? That like the waves can crash against me, but I'm a rock who still stays there, who's not moved by that, who's not destroyed by fear.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've found a lot of comfort in that. Maybe it is a masculine thing, that it appeals to a certain like strength that I'm like, yeah, okay, I can relate to wanting to have that sort of a trait.
And
anyway, it's something I
maybe
found
in
really
the
helpful for me.
feminine end, it's nice to like have vulnerability, to be able to be vulnerable enough to your partner that you're able to say, hey, I have these fears. These are what my fears are.
Right.
So allow me to work through them with you and understand that this is what's going on in my head when I'm having these fears and why I'm having them. Kind of delving back into like the reasons behind them. And often that's kind of the tapes that we play when we're children that keep coming up in patterns in our lives.
I think that actually is why that way of thinking about it really resonated for me as a more like masculine identifying person, is because a lot of guys feel like fearlessness means not being afraid of anything.
Sure.
And so the idea of admitting your fears to your partner feels emasculating. It feels like, oh, well, I'm not a man, I'm not manly, I'm weak then. Whereas this Shambhala way of looking at it, of like the true strength comes from having those fears, but still
and facing them.
handling them, facing them. And so it for me, it was like a different framework to be able to present those fears to my partner.
Yeah, that's great.
And actually talk about them and work through them in a way that doesn't feel like, oh, that means that I'm weak. It's something I found is really powerful for men, especially.
Yeah.
I know the thing that I resonated the most with, and I cited this in my book actually, but Dr. Lissa Rankin wrote this book called The Fear Cure.
Right.
Yeah, and I learned about it because I went and saw her speak, and it just blew my mind. But she wrote this entire book about, and the title is kind of deceptive because it's not about curing fear, but it's about using your fear to cure you, essentially.
I see. Yeah.
You know, and it's like this idea that our fears kind of crack us open and let us actually see what it is that we need.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that in those moments that are so intense, you know, when you're having those emotional outbursts, or if you really want to you know, deliver an ultimatum to your partner, or if you're, you know, if you're pulling the ripcord, if you're in panic mode, you know, that there is a power in that, but it doesn't have to be a power that's used destructively towards your partner, or destructively towards your relationship, or destructively towards yourself, but rather used to really illuminate and to really see, like, okay, well, what is this deep nerve that it's touching, and how can I heal that pain, essentially. And that could be through talking it out with your partner. It could be going through therapy, it could be any number of like personal development, or it could be meditation, you know, it could be examining like your past and figuring out like, is there something I'm hanging on to from my childhood that's still here, or from past relationships, you know. And sometimes I think I found what's really useful is sometimes being able to recognize baggage from past relationships and just be able to acknowledge it can be enough.
Oh, that's huge.
You don't even have to worry about, well, somehow I've got to cure this, somehow I've got to get rid of this. But even just being aware of it is sometimes feels it's like 75% of the way there.
Yeah, I mean, I like had a lot of things for when I first started dating Jase that I expected him to do, and I would kind of brace myself for them because I had been in like some emotionally abusive relationships.
Like you expected like negative reactions.
Exactly. From him, and then when it didn't happen, I was like, holy shit, that's a trigger that I just expect, but good human beings who don't do that to me are it's just not going to happen then. And it was very interesting. That fear was kind of an unfounded one that just happened because I had those experiences in the past with other people.
And I think that also having empathy and compassion for your metamors is something that I do want to touch on before we move on, because that's something that I found for me with a lot of these different things. Actually, this one has helped me, but where maybe my partner does feel like they're taking time away from me to spend it with somebody else for some certain occasion, or because something's going on in their life, or perhaps I have this fear of them caring about that person more than me, or whatever it is. But often when I am able to take that step back and actually look at, wait a minute, like I understand that like maybe this other partner's only in town for a little bit of time, or like this is the only time they could get off work, or this difficult thing is happening in their life, or whatever it is, that taking that moment to be like, yeah, of course, like I would want to take care of that person too, is kind of having that opportunity to be like, I'm also part of helping and making things better for my metamor, as opposed to like, well, it's something that my partner does that's separate from me, and I just have to suffer for.
We're all on the same team.
Right. Being on the same team.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's take it to our final one. And the final trigger is loss of control. And this is very much wrapped up in fear, because I think that as human beings, we often fear losing control of our situations or losing control of our surroundings. And often where people come up against this in a non-monogamous relationship is having a lot of difficulty accepting that their partner is an independent human being and that they are going to make choices independently. That there's kind of this fear that like the more freedom and independence I give my partner, the more likely it is that they're not going to care for me, or that they're going to make choices that hurt me.
They're just going to go hog wild.
Exactly.
It's going to be insane.
And it's really tied up in our narrative about relationships. Right?
That we have to keep people under under lock and key, and that they're not allowed to do anything outside of that relationship.
Or the idea that
real human feelings.
Right, that a good relationship is not two individuals, but rather like one combined being, right? Like with terms like
bullshit,
my other half or my better half, or those sorts of things, or even
we've
the concept.
We've so romanticized that,
right, or like
two souls becoming one,
right? Or you complete me, or like in the Bible, like they become one flesh, right? Like there's lots of different ways this is talked about that I actually think is very, very harmful to the way we approach other people, the way that we think that if they have any independence, it means that's somehow breaking. Like,
and very possessive, of another human.
Yeah, definitely.
So
when people kind of feel like they're losing control, if they feel like their partners, if they're afraid that their partner is going to go hog wild, that people try to reestablish this control in some very unhealthy ways. It can be things like prescriptive hierarchy, like
which
as
I
long
think
as
we've been through.
As long
Dedeker.
as I make sure that all your other partners are secondary, then we're okay. It can be things like veto. It can be like restrictions. It can be things like controlling the information that your partner gives you.
Don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah, it could be either don't tell me anything, or it could be you have to tell me everything.
Right. Every little intimate detail.
Yeah, so these are like the funny ways that people try to gain a sense of control again if they feel like the rug's been pulled out from underneath them.
I think also that rules, just in general, the rules people will make in their relationships tend to come from this fear of loss of control. Because I think there is, I want to go back to this assumption of your partner going hog wild.
Sure,
as
yeah.
you so eloquently said. But it's this weird idea we have that if I didn't have rules, or if there wasn't some external structure like monogamy or marriage, or whatever it is in your case, if there wasn't some external structure controlling my partner, that they wouldn't want to be with me.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of this
It is
insidious
really odd.
underlying assumption that's
Totally.
there.
Yeah.
But I totally bought into it for so long.
God,
Like, I remember being
didn't we
younger.
all?
No, and constantly being afraid that like somehow my partner was just like settling for me, and like there was
Yeah.
really other people he wanted to be with, but
Yeah.
he just kind of
Right.
like I just
Decided.
kind of showed up at the right time in the right
Jeez.
place, and
I remember once in high school, I had a teacher who somehow we got on the subject in class about relationships or whatever. And she was talking about how there was a guy that she was dating who, would tell her those things like, I don't even see other women, or right, or like I only have eyes for you, like those sorts of sentiments, right? And that she was telling us that she was actually very frustrated about this, being like, no, like I want you to look at them and see them and then still want to be with me.
Yeah.
Right? Like I don't want to think you're
That's
only with me
interesting.
because you have
you have
blinders
blinders
on.
on, yeah.
Right. And I remember at the time, like that was a pretty novel concept. I'd
Yeah.
never considered that. And it actually, like, the more I've thought about it since then, I'm like, fuck yeah. That is a lot of our romantic talk is based around this idea of I don't even see anyone else, as opposed to seeing them and I still want to be with you.
But that's interesting though, because that's actually what I've enjoyed about non-monogamous relationships is this idea that you could be with anybody that you wanted at
But
any
it's a
time,
choice.
and you're still choosing to be with me. It doesn't
Right.
mean that you're still choosing to be with only me.
Right.
No.
But it's like you're still intentionally, actively choosing the time that you want to spend with me. Like
Yeah.
Right.
that you're not here in this relationship because you're obligated to. You're here because
Right.
you want to.
Because you made this commitment 10 years ago, and now you're like,
Exactly.
fuck, I'm stuck
Well,
here.
exactly.
Yeah.
And just the idea that, like, we give everyone choices, such as polyamory or, whatever non-monogamous shape you want to take, and monogamy, and that everyone
Yeah.
can choose which relationship structure they want for their life. That there's not just one option automatically, and that's the only thing that's valid, and
Right.
you're somehow not valid if you're doing anything else.
Right.
Yeah.
So the one last technique that I wanted to talk about as a good technique, I know some of it we've already gotten
Yeah.
into here about,
Oh, yeah.
really approaching, what is this loss of control, and understanding your partner is actively choosing to be with you.
Yeah.
Is Dedeker's pay it forward technique.
TM.
Trademark payitforward.com. No, I'm sure that's taken.
Oh, I'm
Sure
sure.
that's taken.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea with this one, if I can
Yeah,
take
go
over
ahead.
and present this one.
Go ahead, go hog wild.
That's what you're afraid of. So I'll go hog wild if I have no rules. Is the idea that if you're feeling jealous or you are feeling insecure, that if you, instead of trying to grasp for control with that person, that you're feeling like you're losing it, is to instead go out of your way to give extra attention or to say something kind or something sweet or something loving to somebody else, or even to that person.
Yeah.
Whether it's another partner, it could just be a friend, it could be a family member,
Yeah.
that anything, but just focusing on, I'm going to give good things to someone else without them asking, rather than focusing on what I'm not getting and how much that can change things. Do you want to talk more about how it's really...
No, I honestly, I don't understand why it works. I don't understand how it works. Like, I've just known that it works. And I think that particularly when you're in the middle of like a jealousy crisis or a fear crisis where it's like you just feel icky and like all you want is to stop feeling this way right now, like maybe when your partner's out on a date or whatever,
Right.
and you're at home going crazy, that this technique of doing pay it forward, of just being like, you know what, I'm going to send a text message to my sister, just telling her how much I miss her and asking how her day was. Or I'm
Right.
going to send a message to another partner, maybe call them up and just see how their day was and tell them how much I love them. That I've seen that to be the technique that goes the fastest from I feel like shit to actually I feel okay, or even I feel good.
Right.
Maybe it's, or is it just like stopping that continuous cycle in your head of like,
Well,
I'm
part of it,
jealous, I'm
there's
jealous, I'm
something, like,
jealous?
Anything
Do
that
you
can
think
get
that's
you,
part
that
of it?
can
Yeah.
get you outside of yourself
Exactly.
and onto another person, not
Yeah.
just onto a thing, not just onto like a video game or a book or whatever. Which
Yeah.
I mean, not that those are bad distractions, but something that puts you actively in this role of doing something for somebody else
Yeah.
that's outside of you.
Yeah.
I think helps to cut that cycle, that like that negative feedback loop in your mind
Totally.
that's driving you crazy.
I think that there's also part of it that makes you realize that your world is bigger than just this one person or this one situation.
Yeah.
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 Because I feel like
Absolutely.
with a lot of these, like with competition about the amount of time or, comparison or fear, that a lot of times we get caught up in, even if we have other partners, this one that's triggering some jealousy for us, that's all we can think about is what we're not getting here, what we're not getting here, rather than realizing, actually, wait, I have a lot of amazing resources, whether it is friends or family or other partners, whatever it is, that there are other people that I get positive feelings from, that I can talk about my feelings with, that I can spend quality time with, that I can get a lot of these same things too. And I think the Pay It Forward also, in a way, helps remind you of that.
Can I be Buddhish?
Yeah.
Real quick in
Yeah.
relation to this. This actually reminds me of the last time I was on retreat, a story that a Buddhist nun told me about the Buddha. That there's this parable that essentially that the Buddha asks somebody like, so if I have an egg cup, like a tiny cup full of water, and if I pour a spoonful of salt into it, are you going to want to drink it?
No.
Like, no, it's going to be super fucking salty.
Right.
That direct quote from the Buddha. But he
you
said,
fucking
but
won't.
what if I pour a tablespoon of salt into the river? Like, would you drink water from the river?
Yes.
And like, you probably still would. And so it's this idea of like, if you learn to step back and kind of expand your awareness and expand your compassion, that it doesn't become so tight and hyper focused on like all of the pain in this tiny little world that is you.
Right.
That as you start branching out and connecting to other people and kind of expanding your world, essentially, that over here maybe it's a little bit uncomfortable, but in comparison to the rest of what my focus is, it's actually quite small.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think our overall takeaway from this is that if you're feeling jealousy or envy, whatever you want to call it, is to know that you're not failing.
No.
Right? It's like Emily was saying.
It's a universal emotion.
Exactly. We all feel it. It's something that we all go through all the time in our lives. And that just because you're feeling it in an emotional, romantic or sexual way doesn't mean that's some failure or that it's somehow insurmountable. But it's just part of life. It's part of being a human being.
But it's the way in which you react to it.
Yeah, that's the
And
thing.
the way in which you choose to combat it.
Yeah, and being able to see these triggers, I'm sure there's many more triggers than just these four broad
Sure.
categories. But, if you are able to kind of, notice when you feel jealous and notice like, oh, something triggered it, and just to be able to step back and again, be out of just the thick of that emotion, you can kind of access some more clear-headedness in order to manage it, communicate it effectively, and deal with it in a much more healthy and constructive way.
Yeah. Awesome.
Sweet.
So we just recorded an hour-long episode.
Yeah, a page and a half of notes.
We're still in our live show mode.
a little bit, but,
Yes.
but
We
we
love
hope
it.
it helped.
Yeah.
Y'all out there.
Hope this was helpful for you. If you want to check out more of us, please subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or Podcast Addict or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also check us out at multiamory.com. You can find us on Facebook, Multiamory, on Twitter, on Instagram, Multiamory Podcast, right? Like all over the place. Just type Multiamory into Google and you'll find us. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to have you as part of our Patreon community if you want to contribute to helping us continue to do this show. But also just send us an email or tweet at us. We love interacting with you guys out there. You're the reason why we do this show and why we've kept doing it now for over 2.5 years.
Yeah.
So thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
See you next week.
Bye.